Hello and welcome to Hexed Encountered. My name is Joe. Today I'm going to be continuing my OOTP24 series on Mythic League Baseball. We are going to look at the 1872 season, the second season here. And before I get started, I wanted to talk about a couple things relating to setup. So let's jump into the league settings, which is available right here under your league menu. And so in here, we're going to go to stats and AI. So before you start your season, it might be a good idea if you're doing a fictional historical league, or even if you're doing a historical league, although the game should do this automatically. Doesn't really hurt to double check. You come in here to this league totals area and click select year. You'll get this menu here of all the different years in history. So since we're 1872, you come in here and you click it. Now you can see it says operation complete. You can now run the auto calc of the modifiers if you wish. So I will click OK. So now you can see also that all of these are set to 1. Okay, but we want to actually have them be adjusted to be what they should be, because these are the modifiers that will be based on this, and it kind of compares it to the player ratings behind the scenes so that you get realistic results. So that's important if you're doing, obviously, historical play. You want, a 19th century game to feel like a 19th century game and generate statistics that are in line with a 19th century game, right? So we click the auto calc modifiers. It'll do its thing. Doesn't usually take very long. And now you can see these numbers have changed. So these are the actual league totals for the NA for the year 1872. And again, now it's going to look at the player ratings behind the scenes, and it's going to say we're going to adjust hits, doubles, triples, homers, etc., down the line. Probably doesn't have hit by pitch data, and that's why it's data 1. At the bottom here, you can see your batting average on balls in play. You can also see your league average, on base percentage, and slugging percentage. Okay, so obviously this era of baseball, you didn't have a lot of slugging going on, but that league average is pretty solid, actually. And then down here you can see also that these are adjusted based on the season as well. So your stamina is a little high for pitchers, your ground ball percentage. I mean, the statistical depth of this game is really impressive. It's one of the things that I think is most impressive about it, is that it's very capable of modeling realistic results from every era of baseball. The problem some people might have is something might not be set up correctly, because if it's not set up correctly, you're going to get information or results rather that look bad. But again, it usually will boil down to setup. The game is a baseball sandbox. I know I've said this many times. And if you put in a little extra effort to make sure that everything is correct in your setup, you're going to get better results. So you can see the same thing applies with position modifiers and the error rates, which are very high. 1872, nobody was wearing a glove, so there were a lot of errors going on. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you. Some other things over here, you might have AI roster, or you do have AI roster settings, I should say. You can set your rotation size. Again, this was Iron Man baseball. You had 9 men. They played the whole game. If your pitcher gave up 20 runs, he gave up 20 runs. That's just pretty much how it is. They might swap them out and put them in, somewhere else, put them in left field or behind the plate or at third base, whatever. Positionally, there was a lot more flexibility than there is now. Everything now is very specialized, as you well know, if you're a follower of baseball. Back then, there was a lot more, flexibility in how the players roles, so to speak. But still, by and large, a pitcher was a pitcher, and everybody else had their position that they played the best, that they were the most experienced at, etc., just as they do now. So you would have basically a one-man rotation. Some teams might throw in another guy, but usually that only happened if we had an injury. So one-man rotation. Relievers, it does actually go to 0. Really, there were no relievers. You had position players maybe who could pitch in a pinch, but they weren't like designated relievers. There's no such thing as a bullpen, stuff like that. Very, very beginnings of professional baseball. So I think that probably covers what I wanted to show here, except for one thing. So if we go over to this options tab or options screen, you can see that you have the ability. I have all the awards turned off, as you probably notice over here, but what I wanted to talk about was the schedule. So I talked about editing the schedule earlier, and you can only do it at certain times of the year. You can only run the function where you can generate a schedule and basically replace it, completely in one go. You can see here there's a schedule loaded from file. This is the file that I created. I edited it based on the actual 1872 schedule, but I had to tweak it to account for the Chicago White Stockings, who had a fire that burned down their ballpark along with a big chunk of the city of Chicago. And so they did not play in 1872 and they did not play in 1873. But I didn't want to remove the franchise, because if you remove a team, you delete it. When it comes back, it has a new team ID, and you cannot link the two histories together. I want the White Stockings to have a history that goes back to 1871. This is the team that eventually becomes the Cubs. I wanted it to basically run all the way back to the very beginning. So they're going to have 2 years where they will show up in the standings as basically like a 500 record, but their record's going to be 0-0 because they didn't play any games. So the franchise is essentially inactive, but I did not want to remove it for the reasons I just provided there. So you can do things here with edit league schedule, and you can go through and see all the games on various days. Now this is, again, based on the actual NA schedule from 1872. If you open that up, you would be able to see that it was the Canaries at the Olympics on April 18th, 1872. That was the first game of the season. You can kind of advance here by day, go through, see other games, a lot of single games. The Mutuals played a whole bunch of games. The scheduling back then was very chaotic, and teams sometimes didn't meet their scheduled agreements. They didn't meet the agreements they had made with other clubs. The NA was very chaotic in this regard, so there was a lot of kind of a jury-rigged sense of how things worked out, and that actually ended up being the demise of the league, because the people, the money men, just like now, there were wealthier people who kind of ran these teams. I don't think they called them owners yet. They were more like backers, but they got tired of this stuff, and they needed a more centralized organization where they could actually penalize teams that decided, hey, it's September 1st, my team is terrible, I don't want to pay to send them out to Chicago, or I don't want to pay to send them to New York. Depending on where they're located, obviously that could be a fairly expensive endeavor to ship 10, 12, 13, whatever it was, men via train to these cities that in some cases were a long ways away. And this is 7 years after the Civil War. This was not a modernized country. The Industrial Revolution was still going on. The train was the only way to go any distance, and it took a while. So, and it also wasn't cheap by the standards of the day. So enough on that. Let's go back to our league homepage. Okay, so we are at opening day. Now, if you're familiar with OOTP, you'll know that on the league homepage, you'll get your leaders, and for individuals and teams. You'll have some standings at the bottom, and then the news here. So what I'm going to do now with the 1871 season, I played the whole season out all at once in one go. This time I will actually go month to month. So we will just go play, and then we'll play till the next month, like so. And what is going on here? I don't think I have. Oh, I forgot something. I need to turn this. Let's do this. And then we'll do not allow AI roster changes, because I don't want them releasing players and signing players. There are a handful of free agents, but the rosters are basically set. They'll pick up anything that can throw a pitch. because the AI always feels like that needs extra pitchers. We're not going to worry about that. So I do have injuries set to very low so that the players should be able to get through the season by and large without any real incident. So now if we go back to the home, you can see the Canaries actually won that game. They beat the Olympics. And so if we just go in here again and we say, let's go to the next month, now it should kind of zip through it, which it did very quickly because we were already in the middle of April, so it only had to go about 2 weeks. And so you can see here, and here down here is the White Sox. They have not played a game, of course, but neither have Cleveland or Philadelphia or Brooklyn. Actually, neither Brooklyn team. There were changes to the structure. This was, again, a chaotic era. We have 2 new Brooklyn clubs. We have a new Washington club. I believe that is the Nationals. The Olympics were around in 71. Middletown is here. We lost Rockford and Hart. I know we lost Rockford, and there's other teams. There's a couple other ones, and I can't remember right now, so I apologize for that. So we do have a shifting cast of characters in terms of teams as we go forward. So we do see here that basically New York is kind of in the driver's seat. They're 4-1. Boston's played 1 game and won it. So let's go to June and see if anything good has happened in June. Now you do get your news stories generating as well. And so now we have everybody, I believe, everybody except Chicago has now played some games. Middletown, surprisingly, is in first place. Really didn't expect that, but we'll see how they do here as we advance to July. Okay, so now that we're in July, we're approximately halfway through the season, approximately. We do have July, August, September to play, so maybe I guess we're actually a little bit less than halfway through the season. But you can see here we've got some stats now. People are putting up the counting stats. We've got some decent batting averages. You also have some decent ERAs. We can look at various teams. If we went to the Boston home screen, you can see where they are. They are 9-10. They're actually under 500, which is a little bit surprising. You do get thrown curveballs occasionally by OOTP. I see this in my Figment League as well, where teams that people kind of think don't have a shot end up being very good, and vice versa. Teams that people think are extremely good, and in fact they really are good, they just have a bad year. So if you do follow Figment, because it does have a pretty decent presence on the OOTP Dynasty board, you would probably know that the Chicago Cougars are considered one of the best teams in the league. And talent-wise, they definitely are, but they had a terrible season. We just wrapped up 1947, and they finished in 7th place, which is a monumental shocker based on how talented that team is. But it happens. So one of the things I like about this game is it's not always going to be the best team on paper wins the pennant. There's ups and downs. You have injuries. You have hot streaks, cold streaks. All that stuff is in this game. So we'll skip ahead now. Let me go back to the league home first. If you haven't seen it, we do have kind of a newspaper page. It's not really laid out like a newspaper, although they do have one here that is laid out like a newspaper, except sometimes it does things like this where it kind of bleeds over. And I didn't really get into kind of all the storylines and things that you can edit as well. This game is incredibly detailed, and you can take advantage of that if you wish, or you can kind of ignore it too. But we have all our news stories here, and they're giving like monthly awards because they do that. It's not really historically appropriate or realistic, but there's no real harm in it. It will show up in the players' history though, and you can see this guy Tim Mooney played for Rockford last year, and now he's on Baltimore, which is one of the new teams. If we click on him to go into here, and then we went to his history, you can see that he won a Player of the Week, and then he won Player of the Week again, and Player of the Month. So that's what I mean. It tracks their history and stuff. You also can see their salary. This happened because I hadn't folded Rockford yet. I did everything on January 1st of 72, so it kind of shoved Rockford in there, which is fine. I mean, they're not going to play any games. The team is gone. You know, they had their 1 year shot at Major League Baseball, and now they're done. So we'll go back to the league home, and we will play on to August. And it can zip through this league pretty fast because it's 11 teams, I think, and there are 15 players per roster, so there's not a whole lot going on. They're playing a very short schedule, and so it can zip through this. You know, if you have a gigantic universe with full minor leagues and everything, it can get slower. But generally speaking, the performance of the game is pretty good, in my opinion. So it looks like Philadelphia has gone on a hot streak here. They're now 16-5 and in first place. So they're on a 9-1 run in their last 10 and a 5-game winning streak. The Canaries are second at 19-8. Middletown is third. Now, historically, talking about the NA, it's not like these clubs were expansion clubs, the way we would think of expansion clubs today. These were teams that were playing either professionally or amateur wise in another quote unquote league. You know, the Baltimore Canaries, for example, they weren't part of the NA in 1871, but they were a club, and they were doing what we would probably call barnstorming, going around and playing other pro clubs and town clubs and things like that. So this is a team that had some players that came in kind of, you know, whole cloth into the NA. In our case, they picked up some players from the teams that disappeared because these guys had established themselves as being pretty good professional players. So you, just like you would now, you sign them, essentially a free agent, because the club they were with no longer exists. The reserve clause and all that stuff was not really a thing yet. That will come in down the road, and I will talk about that when we get there. So it's not really a surprise, is what I'm getting at, that Baltimore would be decent or Middletown would be decent, because these were clubs that they didn't just spring up out of, you know, nothing. They have a little bit of a track record behind them. Move on to September. And so, yeah, I mean, you get a rookie of the month. I named this guy. I do that a lot with my fictional leagues. The Figment League is full of guys with names that I've come up with. It's a little creative outlet for me. So Lash Blondell is a good young player, obviously. He's a pitcher, and he's on Brooklyn. Which Brooklyn? You can tell by the A that this is the Brooklyn Atlantics, which are the better, I believe, of the two Brooklyn teams, talent-wise. Yeah, the Eckfords are a whopping 0-19. So that is really, really not good. Will they win a game? That's something we should watch for. And again, we have Baltimore and Philadelphia basically look like they're battling it out. Now, by the standards of the time, Baltimore's running away with things because they looked at total victories as the determining factor for the quote-unquote pennant, which they didn't call a pennant back then. They just called it the championship. So Baltimore looks like they're going to win it by those standards. Of course, the game itself uses what we use now, and it's all based on kind of win percentage, and you have games ahead, games back, etc. And so we are now basically closing in. The last game you can see here is actually on October 31st, a little Halloween baseball. So we do have 2 full months left, but that last month is going to be full of a whole lot of empty days, essentially, because teams did not finish their schedules, as I mentioned before. Okay, so now we have New York's pitcher. He went 10-1 for the month of September, and he got the Rookie of the Month. Again, none of these awards would not have been something that existed back then, but they're good conversation points, right? You can see here that the game has awarded Baltimore the pennant. They've clinched, essentially. And hey, look, Brooklyn won a game. They're 1-25. You did have some teams that were really brutal. I don't think anybody's ever been as brutal as this historically in the NA, but it is what it is. So we do have 1 month left. And yeah, so it looks like Baltimore, Philly, New York. Middletown has kind of faded back. And you can see they've only played 24 games. Baltimore's played 49. Philly's played 44. New York's played 49. Troy's only played 25. These smaller clubs started to run out of money because it costs money to travel around and, you know, put up in a hotel and all that stuff. So they said, hey, you know, Baltimore's running away with things. We're kind of done. We're going to pull the plug here. All right, let's do our last month. All right, so we are at November 1st, and the season is over. Baltimore is your pennant winner by whatever measure you wish to use, the measure of the day, which would say they won 41 games, they're the champions, or the measure of today, which says they had a 707 winning percentage, and they're 5.5 games ahead of their closest competition, which would have been the Philadelphia Athletics. Troy and Middletown, then you have New York fell to basically 5th place, but would have been second according to the measures of the time. As I mentioned, they had 32 wins. That's the second most. Brooklyn won 2 out of 29 games, which is awful. The Nationals hardly played any games. The Olympics didn't hardly play any games. There weren't a lot of baseball, I guess, in Washington in 1872. Cleveland, a lot of these teams didn't play a whole lot. So the teams that did play a decent number of games, you have the Brooklyn Atlantics, Boston, New York, Philly, and Baltimore. And the Eckfords also played 29 games, but could only manage to win 2 of them, which isn't all that great. So we can look at some of the statistics here. So if we go to the stats, you get our leaders, right? Blue Brahmin led the league in hitting at 431. Al Bean hit 3 home runs. And so did, Clifford Goldsberry and John Harper. Harper's 51 RBIs were the most. We can look at the pitching side. Joe Bingham from Middletown, 2.23 ERA. Tim Mooney, of course, started every game for Baltimore. Won all 41. So he went 41-17, and that's a pretty good ERA. That's a whole lot of innings. Imagine throwing 500 innings today with the way the game has evolved. That's really ridiculous. Here's Brooklyn in a nutshell. Howard Carruthers, 26 losses. Look at his ERA. Oh, it's 5.26. That 2-26 had me thinking it was 2.26. So there. Reading is fundamental, my friends. 5.26 ERA, but they didn't have anybody else. That's the thing. Today they would have been like, get out of here, and they would have replaced them. Our top save guy with zero saves and a 9.69 ERA, Clayton Abbott, who's a second baseman. So there you go. He pitched 13 innings, but he's a second baseman. 1.1 Ks per 9 led the league. There you go. All right. So that's kind of the leaders there. And it's got some cool stuff. You got hot and cold. You've got your streaks, 28-game hitting streak. Apparently, George Justice from New York has an active 21-game streak. Then you have projected numbers for pitching and batting. And then you have the sortable stats, which just kind of lets you go in here and say, I want to see, batting stats. And then you can sort by at-bats to see that Jim Walsh of Baltimore had the most at-bats. And apparently he played for New York in 71, but moved on to Baltimore. There were no real multi-year contracts. There were no contracts, probably. Guys just played for a team, and if they didn't like it, they moved on. No reserve clause. So things were, as I mentioned, chaotic. And I try to model that with this league. I move players around and so on, so that, I want to model that chaos, which is kind of strange when you think about it, that you're trying to design chaos, right? You're kind of like, I'm acting like the finger of God here, but I'm trying to generate chaos that way. So it's a little strange, but that, as they say, is that. So there's our 1872 season. I'm probably not going to ramble on any longer here. I did want to kind of take you through the season in a little bit more of a deliberate pace, so that you could see things as they develop. We could maybe learn about some of these players. I don't want to go through everything. I'm not going to break down all the statistics and all that stuff. But Baltimore was good. They won. The Brooklyn Eckfords were terrible. Most of the smaller markets didn't bother to finish the season. And that's just, kind of a snapshot of the way 1872 baseball actually was. So that's going to do it for now. I do appreciate you guys watching. Hope you got something out of it. But yeah, that will do it. So my name's Joe. This is the sports edition of Hexed Encountered. And until next time, as always, happy gaming.